So, when leaving Australia, one of the key questions that expats have is that how can I determine if I am a non resident or not? Well, there are a few key tests that ATU uses to determine that, and that is what we are going to cover in this video. Today, I'm joined by Bradley Murphy of Murphy Tax based in Melbourne, who are the experts in expat taxation in Australia. Bradley, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Shiraz. Thank you for having me on the podcast today.
Sure. So, Bradley, as I have laid down the question, right, what are the key tests that ATU uses to determine the tax residency or tax non-residency for an Australian citizen or resident?
Yeah, fantastic question. So essentially, there are three tests of tax residency for Australian expats to consider when leaving Australia. They are essentially the 183-day rule that says if you spend more than 6 months of the income year in Australia, you're deemed to be tax resident. The second test is the Resides Test, which means, objectively speaking, based on your behaviour and intentions, are you residing in Australia? There are a number of factors to consider under that test. And the third test is the domicile or permanent place of abode test. So it's really important for Australian citizens that are leaving Australia to think about all three of those tests. And the key one for an Australian citizen that is looking to leave Australia and say move to Dubai or overseas and become a non-tax resident is that permanent place of abode test. That test effectively says that as an Australian citizen leaving Australia, you would need to establish a permanent place of abode in the UAE to become a non-tax resident of Australia. And that test looks at really a number of factors and your intentions to satisfy that test. You would need to effectively have established a home over in the UAE through a permanent visa, through setting up a company over there, through normally having your family over there with you. And of course, having a residence visa in the UAE. But at the same time, it also look at your Australian ties as well. So you need to make sure that, to the extent possible, you've cut your ties to Australia. And that would look at your property ties to Australia, what assets and investments do you have in Australia, and in particular, any Australian family still living in Australia. So that test is one that's really key to become a non-tax resident. And it does look at all your intentions and behaviour.
Yeah, thank you, Bradley, for that explanation. Now, I would also like us to cover the other two tests as well, the Resides Test and the 183 days test. So if you can, share some details on that as well.
Yes, of course. Yeah, so the other two tests are the Resides Test is often more relevant for inbound Australian expats or returning Australian citizens that looks at are you spending enough time in Australia to be considered a resident under the Resides Test. Now, again, this test looks at a number of factors to be considered. For example, where is your home based? Where is your family based? Do you have the intention to stay in Australia long term going forward? So it's quite possible to actually satisfy this Resides Test and only spend a few months of the year in Australia. So that's probably one big misconception that we often see is that it's not a case of spending more than half the income year out of Australia to be a non-tax resident of Australia. You can actually spend only a few months of the year in Australia and still satisfy that Resides Test based on your factors. It does look at a number of factors, as we sort of spoke about. It looks at where your home is, where your property is, where your family is, what ties do you still have to Australia through employment or a business. So it can be very common that you can still be a resident under that Resides Test, even if you spend most of the income year out of Australia. The other one, which is the well-known test, the 183-day test or 6-month rule, would effectively say that if you spend more than half of the Australian income year in Australia, you're deemed to be tax resident as well. So that's the one that everyone does know very well, of course.
Thank you. So, Bradley, I see quite often that when my clients move to Dubai, they have the intention to become a Dubai tax resident and break their tax residency ties to Australia. That's the ultimate goal. But do you see any situations where the client can be a dual tax resident? And what would that situation be, and what would be the implications of that?
We certainly do. It is quite common. Obviously, you can register with the UAE tax authorities and be a tax resident in the UAE, and also at the same time be tax resident of Australia as well. So I think it's really important to recognise that just because for immigration purposes you've got a UAE residence visa or you're registered with the local authorities in the UAE or any foreign country, it does not mean that you're tax resident only in the UAE or that foreign country. So it's very much possible that if you still have ties to Australia, you can also still remain an Australian tax resident and, of course, still pay Australian tax until you've broken your ties to Australia. So it's important to also be aware that there is no tax treaty between Australia and the UAE. So unlike the UAE and the UK, for example, that does have a double tax treaty to offset or prevent double taxation, at present there is not one between Australia and the UAE. So if you are a UAE resident, unfortunately, if you're still Australian resident, you still pay the Australian tax on that UAE income. So that's something to be very much mindful of as well.
Thank you for that input, Bradley. And one more common situation that I see is when clients try to register in Dubai, they register themselves from Australia, but then they travel around a lot in Europe, in Southeast Asia, and they don't really settle down at one place, like 3 months in one country and 6 months in another and 3 months in another country. And they try to maintain the minimum residency requirements in Dubai that are not a lot, from a UAE's perspective. Um, but how does the ATO looks at it? Is there any risk to that? What could happen when ATO assesses your residency overseas?
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, Shiraz, and we see this happen quite a lot. Obviously, given UAE is very much business friendly in terms of setting up a business in Dubai or getting a visa there is relatively quick and efficient. So we see a lot of clients that do leave Australia and get the UAE company or visa, but then travel around a lot after that point. So they will often spend some time in Europe or Asia traveling. That can be a bit of an issue with the Australian Tax Office in the, as we spoke about before, to satisfy that permanent place of abode test, you do have to have a permanent abode or permanent home out of Australia. So there is a bit of a risk there that if you're more nomadic and you jump around a lot and spend little time in the UAE, that in the eyes of the Australian Tax Office, you haven't actually done enough to satisfy that test. So you would need to have a permanent home and spend most of your time in the UAE, for example, for that year, for that period, which is normally at least a 2-year period to satisfy this test. Now, of course, you can travel. You can travel for work. You can travel for leisure, for holidays. That's totally fine. But what can be frowned upon with the ATO is this, as if you're, say, spending 6 months in, say, Thailand and 6 months in Bali and then 6 months in Spain and only a few weeks in Dubai. In that example, you probably haven't quite done enough to satisfy Dubai as your permanent place of abode and become a non-tax resident. So that's a very common issue we see.
Sure. Thank you, Bradley, for the answers, and I think that's it for today. I appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, Shiraz. My pleasure.
Well, that's it for today. And if you want me and Bradley to help you out with becoming a non-Australian tax resident, you can get in touch with us by link in the description below. I also recommend that you watch our next video right here, where me and Bradley covers in detail how to become a non-Australian tax resident.